world building takes center stage today as I talk with novelist Richard White.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better role players and better game masters by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. My name is Matt Davids. I am the author of the Book of Random Tables, also Dungeons for the Master, as well as other RPG resource books that you can use in your campaigns. I have another fantastic guest for you today. He is a novelist as well as a role player from way back, and he drops wisdom on world building and game master prep as well as writing. Check it out. My guest today is the author of Terra Incognito, a guide to building the worlds of your imagination, as well as many other books, Richard C. White. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Matt. I really appreciate this.
Just to get us started, when did you decide to become a writer?
Well, I could say seventh grade because I was a big fan of the old teenage detective stories. Okay. The Hardy Boys, Brains Benton, Power Boys, stuff like that. And so I tried my hand at writing one. And I got about, 70, 80 pages written longhand. And my seventh grade teacher actually was nice enough. My English teacher was actually nice enough to edit it for me. Oh. And whoa, did it need a lot of work. But I still have that. Every once in a while I drag it out and show it to myself, especially when I think I know what I'm doing. After that, I actually wound up started my professional writing, though, when I was 15, working for a local newspaper. Huh? It was a little town paper. Pretty much the editor was the publisher, was the writer, was the photographer, and he needed help. So he hired me to cover sporting events at the school. And I turned in my first, couple of articles. And the next Monday, I got a paycheck, and I'm like, there could be something to this. I've been pretty much writing for 45 years now in one form or another. I mean, I'm a professional technical. In my real life, I'm a technical writer. Uh-huh. But I started. I guess you could say I started writing fiction about 20 years ago, and it's kind of gone on since then.
Of course, my audience is focused on tabletop role-playing games.
Absolutely.
You are a gamer as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I got the December of 78, January of 79 was a great time in my life and a horrible time in my life. Because in December, somebody gave me a copy of Lord of the Rings to read, which I devoured over the Christmas holidays. And then 2 weeks after getting back from spring, for spring semester, I was introduced to this game called Dungeons and Dragons. Not even AD&D. I mean, I'm talking the original Dungeons and Dragons. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with the concept. I mean, the role playing, the imagery, everything. My grade point did not appreciate it. There were some times where we had to discuss why we were really in college. But I've been playing. I mean, I started off with Dungeons and Dragons, Tunnels and Trolls, the original Traveler, the original Mutants and Masterminds. I mean, I've pretty much played the original Middle Earth role playing game. Mm-hmm. So I've seen the industry, develop over the years, and it is absolutely fascinating seeing all the cool stuff that's out there now.
Dungeons and Dragons kind of took over your college life, apparently.
Well, and as a matter of fact, when I wound up changing majors, I actually wound up picking up history, and with a focus on medieval history, because I was so enamored with the whole between dungeons, gaming, and then science fiction fantasy that it just seemed like history became a natural degree program for me.
How would you say playing Dungeons and Dragons or other role-playing games has affected your writing novels?
Well, one summer, because usually, in between the summer semesters, I would work, doing some kind of construction job or something to make sure I had enough money for school. One of those summers, I couldn't find work for love nor money. So I basically dug out my old Underwood typewriter and started actually really building my campaign world. And I must have typed 150, 200 pages of countries, rulers, names of ships, because I had set it in an archipelago. And, who was allied with who was unofficially allied. I mean, I built the entire world that summer because, again, I had really nothing else to do. I'm still using that world for my writing.
Wow.
Because I know it so well. So I just set and again, I've got like 150 islands. So I can set all of my stories in what seem to be unique areas, but eventually they're all going to tie together.
Okay. So you're still using that world from back then. That's fascinating.
I've improved it, and eventually I finally converted a lot of that over to my computer. Sure. And I think at one time back, if your listeners remember the old 3.5-inch floppy drives, I had 3 full drives filled up with just data points. Which it comes in handy because as a writer, and as a GM, you always need a name for an NPC.
Yeah.
What town are they from? Who is that guy? Hey, what's the name of the merchant? I don't know. But let me look at my list. Oh, he's Tomas. Okay, there we go. We got Tomas the merchant from Briar Point. Okay, good enough.
So you have this world. Do you then write some of the characters you play as well?
I have. Not in a novel yet, but it was actually in a comic book series that I was trying to sell. It was a series called Chronicles of the Sea Dragon, which is kind of a privateer story. But again, I was taking advantage of this huge archipelago, so I figured, and plus it gave me a chance to write Errol Flynn and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. type stories. And some of the characters that appear in the comic book are characters that I have played at one time or another in my career. After you play them for long enough and you really get to know them, you might as well use them.
Sure. When you run a game, do you write out everything? Do you plan, or how do you approach game mastering?
In the old AD&D type days, when let's just say the rules were a little more streamlined, I could sit down and come up with a game off the top of my head, and run. Depending on what level people wanted to run, it didn't take long to put a game together. Now, with the Pathfinder D&D 5th edition stuff like that, where you've got to worry about skills and feats and this and that and the other thing, it takes a little longer to put stuff together. So I will either create my own, but I actually wind up having to, what I'll do is I'll rough out the adventure path, and then since my group meets once a week, I'll spend the weekend prepping just enough of what they're going to run into at our gaming session, maybe, and a little more, because inevitably they'll go down the left path instead of the right, as gamers are wont to.
Yeah.
And I have used some adventure paths, some of the modules and adventure paths and things and stuff that are out there. I like them. They don't always fit exactly what I want to do, so I still wind up tweaking them anyway.
Well, I just recently published a book called The No Prep Game Master, so that's kind of my take. It kind of explains my take on things. But that's interesting to hear. I've been asking a number of my guests how they prepare, and so it's interesting to hear.
I had one adventure. Well, I used to work at a game store down in Texas, and we had a group of people who drove down to meet And I mean, they came from way out of town to have a game on a Saturday night, and the game master didn't show up.
Uh-oh.
So, I got like 6 people here. It's, 10 o'clock at night. We've just closed the store. They're all waiting for their game. And I said, okay, fine. I'm not going to try and run this guy's campaign because I don't know anything about it, and I'm not going to mess with the characters and what he's got planned for you guys. So okay, here you go. We're going to roll up all brand new characters. They're all first levels. Give everybody here an 18 in dexterity. We're going to run an all first level thief campaign. And I ran them through a little adventure. They got, the mission. They had to get to the town. They had to go into the town and do X, Y, and Z. And then they got to see what came out of there. They got to see the big payoff.
Mm-hmm.
But, it was just a little one-shot thing, completely made it up on the fly as I was going, had nothing. I didn't know. I wasn't planning on running. I was just keeping the store open so that, we would let groups play in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, just what the heck? We'll make up something as we go, and everybody seemed to enjoy it. At least they nobody stomped off or complained to the owner. So sometimes you just gotta wing it.
Now, I think you mentioned you still play now weekly.
Well, when we can get everybody together. The problem is with getting older is, okay, we're meeting tonight. Oh, wait, sorry, kids got choir, got soccer practice tonight. Hey, oh, wait, you're going out of town to a convention this weekend. Mm-hmm. All right, yeah. So,
yeah.
Sometimes we do really, really well, and sometimes, like right now, we're in the middle of a 3-week layoff because of we didn't want to play on Thursday because it was Halloween, and next week one of the guys has a convention that he's helping run, and he has to be there on Thursday for so they can get that set up, and we can't really move it to Wednesday because then one of their kids has choir practice. It's just unfortunately that the ugly part of growing up is you have these things called responsibilities.
Yes. Yeah, so that
they don't tell you this when you're a kid.
Yeah, no kidding. And that's partially why I kind of pick up on the no prep game master because when I'm married, I have 3 boys, and it's just like, when am I going to prepare? If I can get 3 hours to play a game one night, that's all the time that I have. So it's like, when would I prepare to run a session with all that going on? Now, so what have you been playing? Do you play 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons?
We're more of a Pathfinder group.
Oh, okay.
Although we have not decided to move to Pathfinder 2 yet.
Okay.
One, we're in the middle of 4 different adventure paths, because what it is since each adventure path is the Paizo ones has 6 parts to it. Mm-hmm. We'll play like the first part of one, and then we swap out and get in a different DM. So we rotate through them, so nobody winds up having to DM all the time. So we've got several more of those to go. We're in starting to get to the wrap up point, but there's no point in trying to shift over to Pathfinder 2 until we finish up the things we're running. I'm actually running a Freeport campaign, which is a Green Ronin's game that they have that uses the Pathfinder open license.
Yeah.
And that's been a lot of fun. Again, I lean towards that because it has lots of pirates and swashbuckling and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
We have done some Mutants and Masterminds as when we take a break from Pathfinder. We have one of the GMs who really likes playing that game. And if worse comes to worse, we just get out the old Munchkin.
Oh, okay.
Because you can never go wrong, stabbing your neighbor.
Yeah, no kidding. No, that sounds fantastic. I guess let's talk about. I wanted to talk about one of your books a little bit more in detail, and that is Terra Incognito. Can you kind of explain just a little bit of what that book is to the listeners?
Sure.
Before we talk a little bit more.
Yeah. Terra Incognito came about when I was approached by a e-magazine. They were looking for a column on world building for writers. And okay. So I started, and I basically started writing it from a writer's point of view. And I think we had like 16 issues that it was in before the magazine went belly up. And as they are wont to do.
Yeah.
And so I got my rights back to it. And then I thought about it and talked to a publisher, and he was interested. And we wrote about 3 more chapters for it and put it out there. And again, it was originally written for writers, but we wound up putting it on. We submitted it to Drive Through Fiction. And Drive Through Fiction looked at it and went, we're going to stick it on our Drive Through RPG. And it spent like 2 years in the top 10 for reference books, which surprised the heck out of me. And because apparently, and one thing I can say, last weekend this last week I was up in Massachusetts. Becker College up in Worcester, Massachusetts is using Terra as a textbook for their video game design program.
Wow.
So I got to go up and actually do a presentation to at the college and meet some of the people who are actually using it as a textbook and, getting some feedback from them and stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Well, I think, the guy wrote me and said, "Hey, do you mind if I use this as a textbook?" And I'm thinking, guaranteed sales once a year. Yeah, by all means, help yourself. Yes, I'd be happy. Now, do you want me to raise the price? I mean, we can, since it's a textbook now. And he's like, no, let's not get too carried away here.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's.
I mean, it should be at least $120 to $150. I mean, it's a textbook, right?
That's what I was just thinking. Remembering back even when I was in college 20 years ago, it's just 120 was about normal. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, that's fantastic that they're using it as a textbook. I guess obviously. I can understand why, Drive Through Fiction is like, hey, this belongs into, in Drive Through RPG, because world building is something that game masters think about all the time. So maybe could you give us maybe just like, a couple kind of keys that you talk about in that book that really kind of help people to start building a world of their own?
I know you ask 10 different game masters and they'll have 15 different ways to do world building. Sure. But my theory's always been outside in. And if you happen to be a graphics person, it's like adding the layers in Photoshop. Could I just basically start with a squiggle? And then I decide, okay, is this like an island? Is this actually is the squiggle water and everything else around it?
So you're drawing a map?
Sure, but it's not. I'm not a Tolkien type artist. I mean, I'm just doing scribbles on a piece of paper.
Okay. And
I'll just draw a scribble, and then I'll look and go, okay, well that looks kind of like an island, but I think I need more of a bay here, and I'll go through and I'll kind of rough out what looks like to be, let's call it an island. Well, okay, now look, I got a peninsula here. Well, peninsulas don't just normally form, so that means I got to have mountains here, and then probably mountains here. Okay, well, now that we got mountains and we know where the coastline is, look at these indentations. Those are probably where rivers come in. And then once you have mountains and rivers and ocean, now you know where the towns are. And once you know where the towns are, you sort of now can figure out where the countries might be. Well, okay, now let's see. This country here is pretty flat, so it's probably a real farming area. Oh, look at all those mountains over there. That's probably a lot of mining and stuff. And, ooh, look at this. You got this nice shape of a country and another nice shape of a country, except for this one line here where there's like a big blank spot. Boy, what a place for the two countries to be in conflict over who really owns what part of that, blank spot.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, now I've got a story. Now I got two countries fighting with each other. And it's just like I said, you just build one layer on top of the other, and it's amazing how the story can almost write itself as you get going with it.
Yeah, I think it was Tolkien the first time, years ago when I was reading some of his essays or something. He said start with a map. I believe that he said start with a map.
Yeah. And, but that also works. You don't even have to really, do a big world. I mean, I find like if I'm doing an urban setting,
mm-hmm.
It just again, just a little quick squiggle. But okay, Mark, here's where the bar is. And I now know the bar is on the corner of these two streets, so that when I'm writing my story or if I'm playing a game, now I know I don't have to like flip back, all the way back to chapter 3. What the hell did I call that street again? Because it's right there on the map.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't need to like actually make like this, like map like you would see, like, if you were like, looking at Google Maps or something. It just needs to be kind of roughed out. I know that, this neighborhood is over here. This is here. This is where the main street is. So it can be as simple as one street and just knowing what stores are on this street, or it can be an entire city map, or if you're into epic gaming, build the whole world.
Yeah. Okay, so you start with a map and you add kind of layer upon layer. What would be next?
Like I said, the first thing, once you've decided on the outline, you just really need to work on the terrain, because the terrain is everything. Because like I said, the mountains tell you where the rivers are. The rivers tell you where the cities are. The cities tell you where the countries are. Once you've got all that down, then you have to decide who's going to populate it. So you try and figure out, because I lean back on, again, this is where my degree in history comes in handy, but you don't have to be a historian. You don't have to be a geologist. You just have to kind of know some basics.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the territory has lots of open area, maybe, and not many rivers, that looks like an area where you'd see some kind of cavalry. So they're going to be, much more of a horse culture. You can decide if it's heavy or light cavalry, if you want to go with a more Mongol feel or more of a, French heavy cavalry. Obviously, if there's lots and lots of rivers, and a fairly narrow, say like, let's using a real world example, like Chile.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly long, narrow country with lots of little short rivers. It's really a pain in the butt to have to travel on land because you're constantly going over rivers and stuff. So that's a country that probably would have more of a navy, because it's much simpler to, just sail up the coast than have to go overland. Obviously mountain, if you've got a tribe that lives in the mountains, and again, if you look again, this is all historical. They're not going to have much in the way of cavalry in the mountains. Lots of heavy infantry, probably, because again, they probably control the coal and iron mines and such. So they will be much more, you think more, and again, it depends if you're talking an interior mountain range or if you're talking a mountain range on the coast, because mountain range on the coast, you may wind up with, again, more Viking, because again, it's easier to sail than it is to travel overland. So, the terrain really establishes a lot of what you're going to do with your world building. And then once like I said, once who's living there, then you need to decide on, and again, this is all how deep in the weeds you want to get, because you can drill all the way down to what types of currency do they use, what kind of calendar do they use, does your world have one moon, 2 moons, multiple, more than 2 moons? because that will be reflected in the calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Religion can be, affected by the, your cosmology, the stars and sun and moon and stuff, if you choose. And then how did your people get here? People don't just normally just poof appear out of nowhere. So, like I talk about in Terra, I set up an island, and we had the first group of people who were there prehistorically.
Mm-hmm.
And then you saw how waves of colonizers, invaders. However, if you're the guys who were there first, they're invaders. If you're the guys coming in, you're a colonizer.
Mm-hmm.
But so you can see how people got shoved around and moved. Excuse me, based on the waves of colonization.
If you're writing a novel or running a game, like, how deep do you go? That's I know I hear, different writing advice saying create everything, but then other writing advice saying just have, something basic. Like, so what would your advice be on how deep do you go?
How deep you go is really depends on your pain tolerance, or boredom.
Okay.
But whatever you create, the rule of thumb is never incorporate more than about 10% of it. Because, you're running a game, you're telling a story, you're not there to have people admire your homework.
Mm-hmm.
So, I like to go, when I go through, I will, like I said, I have hordes of pages of names.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because I may need one later. But, it's just one of those things where I like doing my prep ahead of time so that I don't have to stop and go, crap, I need a name for this guy. I just go to the list and pick one out.
Mm-hmm.
But, really, I would just focus on what you actually need to tell the story or to run the game. Mm-hmm. Just the trouble is, the more you've prepped ahead of time, and again, if you have time to prep,
mm-hmm.
the more you prep, the more real the world seems to you, and that way it's easier for you to make the world more real to your audience.
Now, you did mention names, because that's always kind of a popular topic among game
Mm-hmm.
masters, and that because in my book, The No Prep Game Master, I recommend keeping a list of names or a random table of names, so you can just kind of create one. You can get one as quickly as possible, because the players always ask the person's name, whether it's just somebody walking down the street or the kids sweeping the floor of the inn or whatever it is. They always ask their name, and so I'm thinking in kind of your world building idea in Terra Incognito, that does the land or the layers of your world affect the names? Like, will you have will it change kind of the style of the names of the characters?
I have, I fully admit I have, I falling back on. You try not to do too much stereotyping,
mm-hmm.
but I find, like, if I've got a deserty area,
mm-hmm.
that I will tend to hit up the old Wikipedia and try to find some good historical Arabic names or,
mm-hmm.
Turkish names or Egyptian names or something.
Mm-hmm.
Again, mountainous regions tend to go Nordic. Again, it's just easier for me.
Mm-hmm.
I find, again, Wikipedia is, while it's horrible for historical female names,
mm-hmm.
If you need, at least it's a good source to, I don't use Wikipedia. Actually, names are pretty safe to pick off there, but I use Wikipedia to get to the sources that they list at the bottom
mm-hmm.
of the page,
mm-hmm.
and then actually go and look up the articles or the books that they are basing these things on. But yeah, I mean, it's just that seems to be the easiest way. I mean, obviously, if I'm doing a modern story, you know, man, just there's people I went to school with, in college and in elementary school and stuff, who will probably be very surprised that they've shown up in some of my games. But sometimes people just have a really cool name and it sticks with you, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to use that. Maybe swap a couple of letters around or something. But it like I said, there's a lot of or mannerisms. I have stolen mannerisms from people I met back in college, a lot for some of my characters.
Now, you kind of alluded to it, and I guess because your background in history, do you tend to use real-world history in your games and in your novels a lot?
I tend to use real-world history as a basis, because there's some really interesting. I mean, again, interesting to me. I admit I'm a history geek, so not everybody's going to find the same thing interesting. But I've read through some of the battles and some of the what went into stuff before the battle, after the battle, what were the consequences of the battle, and I've tried to extrapolate that and say, okay, now in a world where there's magic and dragons and stuff, how can I simulate or replay this kind of recreate this battle in a kind of a pseudo medieval world. And and again, it helps a lot. I mean, the battle's already happened. People have already documented it. So why recreate? Why create something from scratch if someone's already halfway written it for you?
Yeah.
Also, folk tales and fairy tales and stuff. There's actually a lot of good data that can be borrowed from that. And so it feels real world, but it's still there's that fantasy element in it.
That's interesting. I've been thinking more and more about history and using folk tales and legends in games actually quite a bit recently. So I will put a link to Terra Incognito in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, so everybody can check that out. But also, let's just move on just a little bit. And you have written a number of other books. So can you just kind of let us know what are some of the other books you have written, and then we can dive into each a little bit,
okay,
here and there.
My most recent book to come out is called Chasing Danger, which is a fantasy noir. In basically, it's imagine your 1940s, 1950s hard-boiled detective, only in a world where magic and monsters exist. And so it's a blend. It's kind of like what would 1940 San Francisco be like if magic was real? And my detective winds up getting sucked into situations with creatures and shapeshifters and things like that. And he's just a normal human being trying to deal with things that are very non-normal. Another book of mine is called For a Few Gold Pieces More. It is a collection of 10 short stories that I wrote and then got the rights back to, so I released it as a collection. Where it's story where I've taken folk tales and legends from around the world and modified them to fit into this one particular world. But I mean, the idea is I'm trying to avoid tales that have been Disneyfied to death.
Oh, okay.
And basically point out to people that there is more out there than just the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. So, like one of my stories, I took and blended Dracula with Bluebeard, and I think that was a fun one to write. Another one, I did the Chinese version of the Swan Princess, which is definitely got a different slant on it than the regular one that most people know. one of my stories was called Skin the Cat, and I took that from the tale of Cat Skin or Donkey Skin, which is a darker, less wholesome version of Cinderella.
Yeah.
And it was fun to tell, and I love that one because the character Cat, she matches my my protagonist snark for snark all the way through the story, and she's really one of the characters that really holds her own against my main character, and I loved her so much for it. Yeah, so I got those two. Terra's obviously out there. A book I wrote, or a book that's out there that it's a collection or anthology put out by Pro Se Productions, is The New Adventures of Rocky Jordan. Rocky Jordan was a radio show from the 1950s. It was sort of like Casablanca, only set in Cairo. And he's about an American who runs a cafe right after World War II in Cairo, and how he has to deal with all the, and they did it very well, because one, they actually used maps from, even though it was written and performed in Hollywood, they used maps that the United States military had made during World War II of Cairo. So when they say the embassy is on this particular street, or this particular mosque was in this area, or this the Street of Long Knives was down in the native quarter, they really were. And he's also deals a lot with being an American in a Islamic country, and how the culture is different, what one can and cannot do, what they would normally do at home is absolutely not the thing to do in Cairo if you're an American. And I thought the show for a 1950s show was incredibly ahead of its time as far as treating the Egyptian culture with dignity. And like I said, so I got to write a short story set, again, as if the radio show had continued. And we've got 4 stories in that book. And I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to put out a second book here soon, because I've got definitely more stories I want to tell with Rocky.
Now, you also have a number of media tie-in books.
Correct.
So you have written for Star Trek, Doctor Who, Marvel, I believe.
Yes,
and possibly more, right? Can you tell us about some of those?
Well, again, like I said, I started out doing comic books as an independent comic book writer back in the 90s.
Okay.
And at the end of the 90s, a guy who used to be my letterer on the comic book got a job working for a small publisher in New York, and he gave me a call one day and said, "Hey, Rich, you really like the Hulk, don't you?" And I went, "Well, yeah." He goes, "Well, we had an author back out, and I need one more story for this anthology. Would you like to take a shot at it?" And I'm thinking, let me think. Oh, okay, don't twist anymore. Yeah, sure. Now, I had never written a short story professionally, but I'm not going to say no. Now, and even though it was offered to me, that wasn't a guarantee, because I still had to submit an idea. It still had to be approved by Marvel. And, but when we kind of went back and forth, because I submitted an idea, they liked it, but they had already bought a story that was in that particular part of the Hulk's career, and they wanted something else. And finally they came back and said, "Hey, Rich, we don't have an Avengers story. Would you like to write an Avengers story?" And I'm thinking, okay, the Hulk was in Avengers 1 and he gets kicked out in Avengers 2. Sure, I'll write Avengers 1.5. Why not? Okay. And, so I pitched a story, and it wound up getting published. And because I did the Hulk story, I got a chance, because one of the freelance editors at that publisher also did freelance editing for Pocketbooks, who had the Star Trek. And so I approached him and said, "Hey, hey, how do you get into this Star Trek thing?" And he's like, "Well, you need to be a New York Times bestseller." And I'm like going, "Okay, well, he goes, no, wait, hang on a second. You've already got we got this thing called the Corps of Engineers. Now, it's just an ebook series, but, They kind of use it as a chance to work with people and kind of see how they do before they turn them loose with the main characters.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, I'll take a shot at that. And he gave me an idea for, he said, how about we'll try and put together a story like this? And I submitted it. DC, CBS Paramount liked it. And that led to Doctor Who. And then I got another call from that first editor. And he goes, hey, we got this license for this game called Gauntlet. And I'm like, there's not a lot of verbiage in Gauntlet. He goes, yeah, we need to get 3 novels. Okay. So I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. I'd never written a novel, but how hard can it be? And so when they finally got me in contact with Midway, and I'm like going, okay, what's the name of the wizard? Wizard. Is there anybody that you've actually named? No. Do you care what I named them? Not really. Okay. What about are there any towns? He's like, this is Gauntlet. No, there's no towns. It's a dungeon crawl. I said, okay, but I don't want you to do it. They said, but we don't want you to do a dungeon crawl. I'm like, what? They said, no, everybody's already played the game. They know all the levels. We want you to write stories set in our world. And I'm like, but you just told me there wasn't a world. They go, yeah, you get to make one. I'm like, this is so not Star Trek, because Star Trek would never let you do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they are very specific about, Captain Kirk is like this, Captain Picard is like this. Midway was just like, yeah, sure, whatever you want. We just want a book. I'm like, okay. And 115,000 words later, we were ready to go. And which is weird because I actually remember writing that one longhand.
Longhand?
Well, at that time, we only had one computer, and my wife was in college as a computer scientist. So she got the computer Monday to Friday, and I got the computer on Saturday, Sunday. So I wrote longhand Monday through Friday every night, and then I typed in over the weekend all the stuff I had handwritten during the week.
Oh, my goodness.
It was... needless to say, I took that paycheck I got from that and immediately went out and bought my own laptop.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's money well spent, I think.
So I got something out of that.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of fascinating. So I guess I wasn't putting it together that you just started publishing with some of those kind of stories with the media tie-ins with the Hulk story. So
right.
you were doing comic books in the 90s, you said?
I did some independent back in the 80s and 90s, doing independent comics, or as we call them now, self-publishing comics.
Sure.
Was not that was a badge of honor, as opposed to back in the 90s where self-publishing books was like, oh, you're self-publishing. That means you can't be much of a book, because if it was a real good story, you'd have gotten published by somebody else.
Yeah.
Not the same thing today with, independent books are a lot more accepted today than they were back then. But unfortunately, I managed to time out the great black and white implosion. Okay. So I managed to get just started in time for the distributor wars to start and Diamond to basically run all the other distributors out of business.
Okay.
And which meant the retailers were cutting back on a ton of their independent books because, they didn't know who was going to deliver them. Because, when I started my very first book, I had 17 distributors I could send it to.
Mm-hmm.
By the time my third book came out, there was one.
Oh, gosh.
Now, I'm sure that probably made it easier for some retailers, because they didn't have to worry about cutting 17 different checks for, whoever they were ordering from.
Mm-hmm.
But it just made it to where Diamond could basically say, yeah, we're going to give this discount for the big guys, and the rest of you all, we're going to pay this much. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like it, we're the only game in town. But yeah, I was doing a supernatural superhero story. It was called Troubleshooters Incorporated. It was basically a superhero team for hire. Mm-hmm. Because since we can't all be, genius, playboy, millionaire philanthropists, some superheroes actually have to go out and earn a living because someone's got to cover that insurance bill. And that was the idea behind Troubleshooters. Was, that you got a superhero team that's flying coach. They do not have their own, X-wing, or
invisible plane,
or their highly modified SR-71.
Yeah.
Like the X-Men. I don't know where Xavier got his money, and I'm not going to ask. But I can tell you right now, trying to keep a Blackbird fueled is that's going to set you back a couple of $1 million.
Yeah, just for one or two jaunts over to a trouble spot somewhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas my guys are like catching the crosstown bus.
No, that's interesting. And then I don't know. It's just I just find it kind of interesting with the way I've been interviewing a number of authors, and that just seeing the different ways people come into getting their work published and stuff. So I just find
and to tie this back to gaming, I actually used the old Marvel Superheroes role-playing game to basically create the characters I was going to be using in my comic book. Not that I had played them per se, but it was just like, this way I can kind of balance out, and give who's got what, and I mean it's kind of like, hey, I've got it. Why not use it?
Yeah. No, I love that game. That game was great. And
a lot less complicated than Champions.
Oh, well, yeah.
I like Champions, but holy Moses! I mean, it was like that and Chivalry and Sorcery. I mean, like you'd spend like 40. You'd spend like a week creating a character, and the battles were. It was like one battle could take 3 hours in Chivalry and Sorcery.
Wow.
It was the most realistic game out there, but really, that's okay, I attacked this quarter. Okay, I'm, because you'd write out your attacks and your blocks and everything, and then you try to resolve them, and then like I said, each turn was almost like 10 minutes, and you might actually do no damage to either of you, and then you got started all over again.
Yeah, well, I played D&D for the first time when I was 9, and the first game though that I actually bought was the Marvel Superheroes game, and it was fantastic because I was about 10 or so then, and I was just able to play the game. It wasn't like Dungeons and Dragons. I had to have somebody help me make characters until I was older, or I tried, like say fastest Star Trek. It took me, a week to make a character, especially being that young. But like Marvel Superheroes, I mean, you just had a character. I mean, you just sat down and made a character. It was fantastic.
Oh, I remember it used to drive me crazy with the original Traveler, because you would do your character creation, and then you would like have to roll for like what happened. Like say, okay, your character goes to school. Okay, roll on this chart to see what happened during their school. Okay, he spent 3 years in the military. Roll to see, and you could actually die 5 minutes before it was time to start playing, and you had to start all over again. Depending on how mean your DM was. I mean, sometimes they'd look, we'll ignore that. Just roll something else.
Yeah.
Because it was like after a while, it's like, just get a character.
Yeah, I've never played Traveler. I got one of the original books just like a year or so ago, and I was reading through it. But I remember I hear some of those stories about it. I think the kind of the concept of dying during character creation, actually, I find it interesting, but also I could see why it would be so frustrating, especially if you have, like 4 or 5 people sitting around the table waiting for you to get ready to play.
Well, and that happened. Oh God, I remember the old Gamma World, which was the first sci-fi, book to come out from TSR.
Yeah.
And everything out there emitted radiation, to include most of the monsters. And odds are you were not getting a favorable mutation. You were going to die horribly. And I'm like going, why is what is the point of playing if I can't survive more than about 7 minutes into this campaign? It just we wound up having to really rewrite a lot of the rules ourselves because this is who play tested this.
Yeah, well, of course, nowadays things have kind of swung to the other way, right? The people say the earlier games are favored the game master. Now the more modern games favor the player.
Well, it is. I will admit I'm not saying that you can't die, because I've proven that several times, even in my Pathfinder games. Yeah, I mean, you've got so many, between the skills and the feats and the hero points, you can throw something. Oh, wait, I didn't really die. Let me re-roll that, and it's definitely it's harder to. In some ways, it's harder to challenge your your players if you're gaming without just making it. I bring down a 50 hit point or a 50 hit dice dragon just because you guys are annoying me.
Yeah. So as we're closing out the podcast, what advice would you give to somebody who wanted to be a writer?
The first thing I would recommend to anybody who wants to write is to read, and read a lot. If you want to be a fantasy author, I mean, it's certainly good to read fantasy just so you know what's current. So you're not trying to retell the story somebody just sold, because quite honest, if they've just sold it, the market, they've already kind of got their part of the market there. But read outside, read biographies, read novels. I mean, nonfiction, and also try to pick out some good authors and see how they've done. I mean, I'm not saying, because being an old comic book person, especially a comic book collector, I try to keep my paperbacks almost as pristine as I can, even when I'm reading them. But I love to go through and look and see how people like David Drake, when he was doing his Hammer Slammers, if I was thinking about doing military sci-fi, look how he does pacing. Look how he does descriptions of his equipment. I love to say Tolkien, but honestly, Tolkien, the older writers, the Tolkiens, the C.S. Lewis's, stuff like that. That writing is a little out of style right now. So try and get somebody a little closer to modern times. And and again, not trying to copy them, but just look and see how they do pacing. Well, that's like what I did with Chasing Danger, my fantasy noir. I downloaded hours and hours of old time radio, and I just sat there and listened to the Sam Spade, the Philip Marlowe, Night Beat. But what I'm not so much trying to steal lines, but I'm looking at how they phrase stuff. How did they put that little, put that little noir? There's, noir is known for having, good lines, I can't think of one right now, but the idea is that they were known for their patter, and so by listening to the radio shows, I was kind of able to kind of get that rhythm and that pattern, and how did people talk and how did people interact and talk over each other, around each other if necessary. And that's hard if you're not reading, and if you're not seeking out ideas. You don't know what's already been done, and you don't know who's doing it really well. And again, it never hurts to have a good role model.
No, absolutely. I think it's very clear that the great writers were always great readers. So I think that's some great advice. So, Rich, as I mentioned, I will link up Terra Incognito as well as some of your other books in the show notes for this episode, which can be found at dicegeeks.com. So, Rich, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And if anybody has questions that they want to bounce off me, probably the best way to reach me on social media would be through Twitter. And I can be found at Nightwolf Writer.
Okay, guys, that wraps another episode of the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. I really hope you enjoyed the interview with Rich. As I mentioned, I have linked up his book, Terra Incognito, as well as his other books in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. If you want some free stuff, please head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps plus some other RPG resources you can use in your campaigns. And as a bonus, you will never miss an episode of this show. Now, guys, if you want me to continue bringing you fantastic guests like Rich, please head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and consider supporting the show. Every bit of support that I receive on Patreon just lets me know that you want me to keep creating this show. I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.